Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Neurobiology of Trauma, What You Need to Know About the Brain and Trauma, Part 1 of 3, by Dr. Rebecca Campbell, Professor of Psychology at Michigan State University. Dr. Rebecca Campbell is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. She holds a PhD in community psychology with a concentration in statistics, also from Michigan State University. For the past 25 years, she has been conducting community-based research on violence against women and children with an emphasis on sexual assault. Dr. Campbell's research examines how contact with the legal and medical systems affects adult, adolescents, and pediatric victims' psychology and physical health. Most recently, she was the lead researcher for the National Institute of Justice-funded Detroit Sexual Assault Kit Action Research Project, which was a 4-year multidisciplinary study of Detroit's untested rape kits. Dr. Campbell also conducts training for law enforcement and multidisciplinary practitioners in civilian, military, and campus community settings on the neurobiology of trauma. And without further ado, here's Rebecca Campbell.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on the neurobiology of trauma, what you need to know about the brain and trauma. This is going to be part 1 of a 3-part webinar series. In this 3-part webinar series, what I want to do is share with you how research on the brain can help us connect the dots, how this research can help us understand what victims are experiencing during a sexual assault, and how that affects how they behave in the immediate aftermath of the assault, and in turn, what that will mean for cold case investigations and notifications. For all of your jurisdictions that have large numbers of untested sexual assault kits, you're going to be going back in time, going back to the initial police report. Victims are going to be going back to that initial sexual assault. So what we want to do in this webinar series is help you connect those dots, help you understand what the initial trauma of the sexual assault was like, how that affected their initial behavior when they reported to the police and had that sexual assault kit collected, and now where they may be at, however many years. Maybe it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 10 years later, now that you're doing the cold case investigation and notification. So in this first part of our 3-part series, we're going to discuss how the brain and the body react to major traumas, including sexual assault, and then we're going to focus on understanding what that means for victims' behavior during the assault itself and in that immediate aftermath, what they're like when they report to the police, what might be happening when they have that sexual assault kit collected. And then by way of preview, in our second part of the webinar series, we're going to again pick up with what the brain and the body do during major traumas. And then we're going to focus on understanding what this means for memory formation and memory recall during the assault and in that immediate aftermath. How does the trauma affect what victims are able to remember about the assault? And then finally, in the third part of the webinar, we're going to take these two pieces and put them together and examine the implications of this information for cold case investigations and victim notifications. So without further ado, let's talk about what we know from research on the neurobiology of trauma. So research from a variety of disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, medicine, nursing, public health, has helped us understand what is going on for victims during the sexual assault. And 2 well-known psychologists in the area of trauma research, Dr. Jim Hopper and Dr. David Lesak, did a nice summary of what this very large, multidisciplinary body of research has taught us about trauma in the brain. And they summarized this as follows. They said, in the midst of assault, the brain's fear circuitry takes over while other key parts are impaired or even effectively shut down. This is the brain reacting to a life-threatening situation just the way it is supposed to. It's an interesting quote. There's a lot here for us to unpack and to learn. One of the first things I want to draw your attention to is this last part. This is the brain reacting to a life-threatening situation. That's how the brain and the body interpret sexual assault. Sexual assault is a highly invasive crime. It is something that is very physically close, emotionally close to the victim's body. Because it is so physically close, because it is so terrifying, the brain and the body respond to this trauma as a potentially life-threatening situation, meaning this is something where the victim's body and brain interpret this as something that might result in them dying, that they might be killed by the attacker. So it responds to this trauma as it would other major traumas like combat, like an officer involved in a shooting, like witnessing a major crime such as a homicide. So the brain and the body react to sexual assault as a life-threatening situation. And in that situation, the brain's fear circuitry is going to take over. We're going to talk more about this in just a moment. But the idea is it's an older, primitive part of the brain that is hardwired to protect us and to keep us alive in potentially life-threatening situations. And when the fear circuitry is taking over, other parts of our brain are going to be impaired or shut down. Some of the parts that are going to be, well, quite frankly, too slow for us when we're in a potentially life-threatening situation. The fear circuitry is going to be driving how victims react to a major trauma. All right, so let's unpack this and start talking about the different pieces and parts of the brain that go into the major trauma response. So what you see here is a picture of the cerebrum. That's the squiggly gray top part of your brain. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is the newer part of your brain. And in particular, this part right here that I just circled for you. This is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is that front part of your brain. It's right behind your forehead. And in your prefrontal cortex, we do what's called executive functions. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that helps us take in different information, help us sort out what we might want to do when we have to make a decision, help us think through pros and cons in a situation of like, oh, maybe I should do this. No, that has some unfortunate, side effects or consequences. Nah, that's not a good decision. Let me do this. So our prefrontal cortex, the executive function, is where we normally do our decision making, our weighing the pros and cons when we're trying to make a decision and then execute a behavior. This is the part of the brain that becomes impaired or effectively shut down in a major trauma because that deliberative decision making process is just too darn slow in a potentially life-threatening situation. In a potentially life-threatening situation, we do not have time for our brain to go through the pros and the cons of different behavioral responses. So this part of the brain is going to be effectively shut down. And other parts of the brain are going to kick in and are going to drive the victim's reactions to this major trauma. So what you see now is a picture of the brain sort of from a cross view, sort of slicing down. So you can see at the top part, the cerebrum, the squiggly gray part. But look underneath that to see that there's a whole bunch of other structures. These lower parts of the brain are older from an evolutionary standpoint. And the key parts of this older part of the brain that we're interested in today are called the limbic system, or, as you heard before, the fear circuitry. These structures are the ones in the brain that are going to kick in a potentially life-threatening situation and affect how a victim reacts to a major trauma such as sexual assault. So let's talk a little bit about the parts and the structures in the limbic system and how they're going to affect victims' behavior. One of the key structures in the limbic system is the amygdala. It's that blue dot that you see there on your screen. Now, one of the key things that the amygdala is going to do is turn itself on, so to speak, and it is going to shut down, so to speak, that prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is great when you're trying to make a decision about what to buy at the grocery store, not what we want right now in a major trauma. So the prefrontal cortex is going to go quiet, as it's sometimes called, and the amygdala is going to be driving what's happening next. This process of the amygdala taking over is what's called an autonomic process, automatic-ish. It means that it is going to kick in and it is hardwired into the brain. The victim is not going to choose what happens next. So what I'm going to be describing next in the webinar is what's happening when the amygdala takes over and the fear circuitry takes over. And it is not what we typically think of as something that you get to think through and decide, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. The amygdala is driving this process. When the amygdala is controlling the process of how victims react to major trauma, this is going to have major implications for victims' behavior and for victims' memory. In the rest of this webinar, I'm going to be talking about what those implications are for behavior. What does it mean for victims' behavior during the trauma and in the immediate aftermath for the trauma to have the fear circuitry controlling how they're reacting? And then again, as I noted before, in the second part of this webinar series, we'll pick up and talk about the memory piece. But for now, let's talk about understanding victim behavior during major traumas like sexual assault. So as I said, with the amygdala controlling the response, it's going to be shutting down the prefrontal cortex, and it's going to be working with the other structures in the limbic system to affect how victims react. So the amygdala is going to signal to another structure in the limbic system called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is an information switching station, if you will. It's a way of communicating with other structures in the brain. So the hypothalamus then is going to signal to the pituitary gland. That's that sort of large purple dot that you see there on your screen. Now you might remember from high school biology that the pituitary gland is what controls the development of secondary sex characteristics and the onset of puberty. And that's true. Today we're talking about a different job of the pituitary gland. And that other job that the pituitary gland has is that it is the master gland to all of the other glands in your body. So if you're trying to get a signal to other glands in the body, what you need to do is signal first to the pituitary gland. So that's what's happening here, is the amygdala signals to the hypothalamus signals to the pituitary gland, and this activates what is called the HPA axis. It's the amygdala firing to the H, hypothalamus, to the P, pituitary gland, down to the A, adrenal glands. So the pituitary gland is communicating to the adrenal gland. Your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. Now, why the adrenals? Why are we signaling to the adrenals? Because the adrenal glands are a part of our body that help us with responding to stress and trauma. And what they do is that they release hormones that help the body respond to stress and trauma. So in a major trauma such as sexual assault, the adrenal glands could secrete a variety of different hormones or chemicals to try to help with the trauma response. Two of those hormones that might be secreted by the adrenal glands are opioids and oxytocin. So let's talk about each one. The opioids are a hormone, a chemical secreted by the adrenal glands that help us manage pain. So in major stress, major traumas, major injuries, the adrenal glands may secrete opioids at very high levels to help us manage the pain that we're experiencing, the physical pain that we're experiencing, the emotional pain that we're experiencing. It's like getting a natural blast of morphine after a major trauma. So when the body secretes a high level of opioids, it blocks the pain, but like all natural narcotics, it not just blocks your pain, it also blocks your mood. It blocks your behavior. It makes you have very flat emotional affect. I'm sure many of you can appreciate this if you've ever had surgery and you go home with your pain pills, your narcotic pain pills, to help you manage the pain. Well, they certainly help you manage your post-operative pain, but they also make you probably a little bit dopey or a little bit flat. You're not showing a lot of emotion. That's what opioids do. So for victims of major trauma, such as sexual assault, when their bodies have a very high opioid pain release, what it means is that their behavior during the assault And sometimes in the immediate aftermath of the assault, like when they're filing a police report or getting a medical forensic exam and a rape kit collected, they're not showing a lot of emotion. Their voice is flat. It's not showing a lot of highs or lows. They don't seem to be very upset. They might not be crying. They might not be showing any emotion at all. They might be describing really horrible things that have happened to them with almost no emotion whatsoever. This can seem puzzling. It can seem puzzling perhaps to them. It can seem puzzling to police, doctors, nurses that they're working with who don't understand the underlying neurobiology of trauma. This is actually a very normal response to major traumas. So even though we might expect that victims are very upset, very demonstrative, show a lot of emotion and crying, some do, but many don't, and this is why. Their bodies in coping with the trauma response are having a very high opioid release, and it's blocking the pain, but it's also blocking a lot of their emotional presentation. So it's important for folks who are first responders to sexual assault to understand that that very flat affect, that very non-emotional reaction is actually a very normal response to trauma. Now, the other hormone that we want to talk about in conjunction with the opioids is oxytocin. This is a hormone that can be secreted as well during a major trauma. And again, it has a similar overall function of blocking pain, but it does it through a different kind of mechanism. So oxytocin is a hormone that promotes good feelings, positive feelings. It's often secreted when a mother is nursing her child. So why would that be released during a major trauma? Well, if we step back and think about it for a second, it starts to make a little bit more sense. The body is trying to block pain. It's trying to block physical pain. It's trying to block the emotional pain of a sexual assault and the physical and emotional trauma of that crime. One way to block that pain is basically to push down the pain. That's what the opioids do. It blocks the pain by sort of pushing it and numbing it away. Oxytocin is another way of managing pain, kind of with a counterbalance maneuver, if you will, by promoting good feelings. So many of you might have worked with a victim who laughs, giggles, smiles, seems almost happy, giddy even, when talking about what has happened to them. And that doesn't seem very normal at all, does it? Until you step back and look at it from this point of view and understand that that laughing, giggling response could be due to this oxytocin release. And it's not uncommon that victims that have that reaction might crash, so to speak, and then go much more into a flat affect of not showing emotion at all. So this cycling back and forth of flat affect to some giddy affect is not atypical. And some victims of major traumas like sexual assault will have that kind of response. So already we can start to see that the response, the neurobiological response to trauma is complicated. And that because of the opioid and oxytocin release, some victims may have very flat affect and not show much emotion at all, and some may have what could be considered inappropriate or odd affect, something that doesn't seem consistent or congruent with what it means to survive a major trauma. But again, actually, these are responses that make a lot of sense when we understand the underlying science of how trauma works and how the brain and the body try to help us cope with major traumas. Let's move on and talk about two other hormones that are often secreted by the adrenal glands in a major trauma such as sexual assault. Those are catecholamine and cortisol. Catecholamine is a hormone that, well, it's like adrenaline. It is affecting how you might react to a major trauma. And for victims who have a high catecholamine release, they get a huge adrenaline rush. Now, depending upon how that hormone balances out with cortisol, it will affect how much energy that they have to behave or react to a major crime, a major trauma. So the catecholamine and cortisol release is part of the underpinning of what's sometimes called the fight or flight response. However, over the past several years, our research understanding of the way the body responds to major traumas has helped us understand that this is more complicated than just fight or flight, that the catecholamine and cortisol reaction is much more complicated and involves some other parts of the brain. And so fight or flight is sort of how we used to think about trauma, but now we have a much more nuanced understanding of how the brain and the body respond to trauma. So it is possible that some victims will have a fight response, meaning that in a major trauma, their bodies will react in a way that tries to fight, physically fight, and defend themselves. But that isn't always going to happen for victims, and instead the brain may initiate a more protective response. Because the problem with a fight response is that, well, you might get overpowered. You might not be able to fight your way out of a situation. So our brain needs to have other options. It needs to have more protective options. Because again, what the brain and the body are trying to do is keep the person alive in a major trauma. And to keep them alive, the best thing to do might not be fighting back. So we have other options. We have other ways of trying to protect ourselves in major traumas. The fear circuitry parts of the brain create what is called a defense cascade. It's a variety of different types of behaviors, not just fight or flight, that might help keep the body alive during a major trauma. So let's take a few minutes to talk now about the defense cascade. One of the other options that we have, besides fight or flight, is freeze. The body can stop, freeze for a moment, so that the brain can assess the threat and try to see if flight is an option. Could we escape? Can we get out? So fight, flight, and freeze are various options available for victims. And the freeze can help see if getting away, if flight, is a viable option. Sometimes it's not, though. Again, sometimes, like with fight, flight isn't going to help the situation. You can try to flee, but you could be chased, you could be caught, you could be harmed even worse. So again, the body needs other options. Fight, flight, or freeze might not be enough to try to keep you alive. So another option, another behavioral response to trauma is tonic immobility. Now, tonic immobility is a more extreme form of a freeze response. It is often triggered by physical restraint. So for victims of sexual assault, they are often physically pinned by their attackers. The attacker is often physically on top of them, grabbing them from behind. Some type of physical restraint of the body, a very close contact of the body. That close contact and restraint for many victims is enough to trigger their defense cascade to go to tonic immobility. Again, this is not something the victim chooses. This is something that the fear circuitry is putting into place as an autonomic response to try to keep the person alive. So when they're physically triggered, physically restrained, this can trigger tonic immobility. Now, during tonic immobility, the body is not able to move. That's why it's called immobility. Can't move, can't talk, can't push back, can't kick, can't yell for help. They're frozen. For victims, this can be very terrifying because their body can't move. They can't talk, they can't scream, they can't do anything. All they know is that they're frozen and they're aware of what's happening to them. A survivor I interviewed many years ago in one of my research projects described this as being awake during surgery. She knew what was happening to her. She was very aware, conscious of what was happening to her body, that she was being raped, but she couldn't do anything. She couldn't push back, she couldn't scream, she couldn't kick. Again, from an adaptive perspective, from a how do we keep the body alive perspective. Tonic immobility, or sometimes as we think about it as playing possum, it'll keep you alive. It might be upsetting, it might be very terrifying, it might be very confusing, but it's physically protective sometimes because, again, fighting back might result in more injury. Trying to flee may mean you may be captured and hurt even worse. So tonic immobility is an evolutionarily adaptive response to a potentially life-threatening situation. It keeps you frozen, it keeps you still, and it keeps you alive through the process. But again, from the survivor's point of view, it can be very terrifying. This is a quote from an interview I did with a rape survivor who experienced tonic immobility, and I like to share this to help give people a feel for what tonic immobility feels like for sexual assault survivors. She said, "I was terrified. I couldn't do anything, and I didn't know why. I didn't want to tell no one because what would I be able to say? No, I didn't fight back. No, I didn't yell for help. I just laid there, wondering if I was going to die." What this quote helps us understand is how terrifying this is for survivors. It helps us understand that it always goes back to that fear that this is a life-threatening situation, wondering if I was going to die. What we also see in this response is how confusing tonic immobility can be for survivors. She didn't know why her body was reacting the way it was, and she figured she was going to have a very tough time explaining this to others, like maybe a friend, a family member, a police officer, a doctor, or a nurse, because when those people would start asking her questions, did you fight back? Her answer was no. Did you yell for help? No. And again, once you understand the neurobiology of trauma, once you understand the defense cascade, it makes sense why she didn't fight back, why she didn't yell for help. But again, at that time, she couldn't do that. And she's afraid that when she tries to explain to people how she reacted, they're not going to understand. And hopefully with this information now, all of us who work with victims of trauma do understand and can start to understand that this is a very normal reaction to sexual assault as well as other major traumas. Another option for the body in the defense cascade is something called collapsed immobility. So again, we could have fight, we could have flight, we could have freeze, we could have tonic immobility, we could have collapsed immobility. Collapsed immobility is also triggered by physical restraint. So this can happen for sexual assault survivors, again, because it's a very physically invasive crime where they're pinned or held by their attacker. Instead of the body going in that sort of rigid immobility state, what we see here is a collapsing of the muscles, a loss of muscle tone and control. Many survivors have described it as feeling like they're a rag doll or some type of cloth toy where they don't feel like they have control over their muscles, kind of waxy movement. Mentally, victims may faint or pass out. So again, in contrast to tonic immobility, where victims are aware of what's happening to them, in collapsed immobility, victims may faint or may pass out for a period of time so that they're not completely aware of exactly what is happening to them at every single moment of the assault. So obviously you can already start to see how this is previewing material we're going to cover in the second part of this webinar series of why victims may not be able to remember each and every part of the assault. One of the reasons why is collapsed immobility. And again, from an evolutionary standpoint, collapsed immobility can be very adaptive, again, in trying to keep you alive. So you're not fighting back, so you are not taking in all of the trauma. You might faint, you might pass out for a period of time. Again, from a survivor's point of view, this can be very confusing. One of the victims I interviewed who experienced collapsed immobility described it as such. She's like, it was like my body wasn't mine. It was like a doll. He was moving my body where he wanted it so he could, and her voice trailed off, and it was very hard for her to talk about what happened next. She did remember. She was able to talk about it, but it was very, very upsetting for her to describe this and describe her reaction. She did not understand why her body didn't feel like it, why he was moving it around, why he was moving her legs, her arms, her body into different positions as he was assaulting her, and not understanding why she felt like she had no control over her muscles because she was in a state of collapsed immobility. So pulling this information together, what does the research tell us about how the brain and the body respond to a major trauma, and what are the implications for victims' behavior during the assault and in the immediate aftermath? Well, this research tells us that victims are in survival mode. The brain is shutting down the parts that affect conscious control, that prefrontal cortex, the part where we make deliberative decisions. Those parts are too slow. We need other parts of the brain, older parts of the brain, the fear circuitry to take over. With the fear circuitry taking over, what's going to happen is not within the victim's conscious control. The different behaviors that come from the fear circuitry are put into place because they are faster, more adaptive to try to keep the victim alive in a major trauma. So whereas we used to think about major traumas as having a fight or flight response, we now understand that this is much more complicated. It could be fight, it could be flight, and there's many different types of freeze responses. So this means that victims may not act the way you expect them to act, and then they may not act the way they expect themselves to act. Again, they're not choosing a behavioral response. The fear circuitry is in the driver's seat, so to speak, and is going to pick what it appears to be the most adaptive response in the situation to try to keep the victim alive during this major trauma. So when we think about what are often called counterintuitive behaviors, not fighting back, not running away, we want to reevaluate that from a neurobiological lens. We want to see those so-called counterintuitive behaviors with the benefit of this research to understand that they're not so counterintuitive. They actually make a lot of sense from the perspective of trying to respond to and survive a major trauma. Now, why is it important for all of us who work with victims to understand this underlying neurobiology of trauma? Because when we work with victims, they have gone through a major life-threatening trauma. And they're turning to us for help, and they're turning to us for understanding. This is a quote from a survivor I interviewed once who said, "All I wanted to hear was, 'I'm so sorry this happened to you. It's going to be okay, and I'll help you, whatever you need.'" No one ever said that to me. No, everyone said I wasn't acting right. Like there's a right way to do this, a right way to be a victim. So when she disclosed and she reported to the police and when she had her medical forensic exam, when she was answering the questions from law enforcement and doctors and nurses, they were acting like her answers weren't right. Her answers were fine. Her answers were correct. Her answers were how her brain, how her body reacted to keep her alive in a major traumatic situation. So it's on all of us who work with victims of major trauma to understand that there are many different ways to respond to trauma, and that what a victim does is a function of how their brain and body felt was the best thing to do at that moment to keep them alive. So this wraps up our first part of the webinar and understanding the underlying pieces and parts of the brain that are active in a major trauma and what its implications are for behavior. In our second part of the webinar, we're going to pick up and talk about what this means for memory processes in a major trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for taking the time to present with us today on the neurobiology of trauma, what you need to know about the brain and trauma. Again, we would like to thank everyone for attending today, and we hope that you found today's webinar very useful and informative. Please stay tuned for the release of Part 2 in this 3-part series. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has